We literally were running all of our click tracks off of an iPod. And the first generation of worship leaders are beginning to retire. A lot of them have already retired.
Yeah.
And there's a whole generation of worship leader that is being raised up right now who has no idea what the church was like before they walked into the church.
Right.
Do I love the blessing more than I love the Lord who blessed me with it?
Yeah.
And if we are willing to have that as our view of worship, we're willing to have a biblical, theological view of God, and we're willing to pursue God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength for the entirety of our life, I think that's going to be the thing I want the next generation to know. Hey, welcome to the RomansTwelveOne podcast. This is our inaugural episode. So this is episode 1. My name is Tim, and I have my daughter, Marty Benda, helping us out to do this podcast. We're going to talk a lot about our purpose on this episode and why we're doing what we're doing. And I brought my daughter along because my goal is really, my purpose of this is to help kind of pass wisdom, generational wisdom, along to the next generation. So I thought, what better way to do that than to have my daughter help out?
Let's go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You ready?
As a Gen 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
I don't know where you'd put me.
I don't know. I don't know that I've thought that far. I think you're probably, and we'll talk a little bit about this later in the podcast, but you're probably a Gen 3, I think would be where I would put you. But you are my daughter, so you could possibly be Gen 2.
Put me where you want to put me. It's like, am I Gen Z or am I millennial?
Well, I think that's
we don't know.
That's the question.
We don't. That is the impending question.
That is the question. I think if you're a Gen Z, you're going to be a third generation worship leader.
Okay.
But if you're a millennial, you fall at the end of the second generation worship leader.
I am either tail end of millennial or very beginning of Gen Z. Very awkward.
Yeah.
Position.
I'm kind of that way with Gen X.
Yeah.
I'm towards the end of the Gen X, like, you know, I'm a few years before it's over, but I'm kind of right at the tail end. So I've got a lot of Gen X in me.
We're the ones no one wants to claim.
It's true. Well, Gen X, nobody wanted to claim anyway. So awesome. So talk a little bit about, as we get going here, what was it like growing up as a worship pastor's daughter?
My favorite thing to talk about is he was making click tracks before click tracks existed. So every weekend in our house, I would hear from my room or from whatever room I was in, him speaking into a mic that was going into his laptop or a desktop, basically making a click track with his own voice. So he was doing the intro 2, 3, 4 before that girl was doing it on the current click
back tracks. Then there was no multi-tracks. There was no loop community. I mean, we were really having to create everything. We were innovating a whole genre of
There
music.
was a time with a snare.
Yeah.
You were keeping time with a snare and recording it yourself.
I think I tried different instruments to try to figure out like what would cut through the mix the best. And what was crazy, I don't know if you know this now, but at the time, we were using MP3 players and we literally were running all of our click tracks off of an iPod.
So funny. So funny. And now, I mean, you see like the band leader now has an iPad.
Yep.
You were doing it before it was a thing. Yeah. So I wasn't just a worship leader's kid. I was the worship leader's kid.
My favorite thing is when you left home and you went to your first church, which is when I guess, and you were working on trying to get on their worship team. And one of the things you came home is like, they were so excited. I knew how to work with a click track because you would listen to me build those.
I was listening to you build them. And then I remember being in high school and joining the worship team. And they used big speaker monitors at the front of the stage.
We called those floor wedges.
I was appalled. As Tim Tibble's child, I was appalled. I was like, in the generation of Tim, why are we using these giant speakers that are blasting me in the face?
Yeah, that's funny.
And also another thing is we always got random in-ears showing up to our door because companies would send you in-ears, which was so funny.
That is true.
Just random. But
this is funny. Okay, just for you guys listening and watching right now, like we've never had this conversation before. So we're like I'm finding things out I had never knew about your childhood. That's
just
pretty funny.
Random or, you know, and this is like a lot of ministry kids I think can also relate to this of like Easter. Who is my dad? Do I have one? I don't know.
That is true.
Easter week, brutal. Okay. And it's funny, like it was early childhood, but some of my like most prominent early childhood memories was you building like orchestras and choirs for Easter, Christmas Eve, like big services. And I remember when I was really young, we did a big musical at the church. Yeah. And you offered to let me be on stage one of the nights. And it was when we did a Christmas shoot. It was. So this is like this is one of my favorite things. Like, I was actually did the Christmas Shoes musical. We did a Christmas Shoes musical. So, it was so which is good. Now voted as like the worst Christmas song of all time, which we just thought was the greatest. There was a scene. I mean, I couldn't have been more than 5. Yeah. And probably. I remember it so vividly. And I was in kindergarten, and we had a segment in kindergarten called Talk Time, where we got to tell a story. And that was my story, that my dad asked me to be in a Christmas Shoes. Wow. You've never told me this story. And all it wasn't even that deep. There was a scene like where there was like a mall or something, and we were all walking in the mall. All I did was cross the stage with you. And I was lit. I was awesome. Like, this is the best. Yeah, we spent a lot of time like building sets and new lights. And like this was before like, you know, all the production of motion and moving lights and colors and all that kind of stuff. We kind of had to do things the old school way and just establish lights specifically for one spot, and you may only use it for 30 seconds in the whole, you know, program, but it was there for that moment that you needed it. And that I will say is cool about being my age, that I literally got to watch that transition happen. Yeah. Like, I remember you getting scrappy. You were so scrappy with it. Like, you wanted something to work. You wanted a click track. It didn't exist, so you just made it. Yeah. Like, you were getting scrappy with it. And that is super encouraging to me in ministry now, because I'm like, sometimes you don't have the budget, you don't have the materials, so you just get scrappy. And I'm like, awesome. Tim did it. That's awesome. Well, part of the reason I want you to be a part of this, and Marty's going to do a lot of this with us, is we really want to bridge a generational gap here. And I think one of the concepts that we're going to use a lot is the idea of the Gen 1 worship leader. Yeah. And the idea that the first generation of worship leaders are beginning to retire. A lot of them have already retired. Yeah. And I'm kind of on the end of that generation. And we'll be stepping off platforms if we haven't already. And there's a whole generation of worship leader that is being raised up right now who has no idea what the church was like before they walked into the church. And you got to see a lot of change in your lifetime. And so really what I want this podcast to be is the sharing of generational wisdom. I mean, I think that's going to be really important as the Bible talks about speaking to one generation to the next about who God is and what God has done. I really want to take some time and make sure we unpack that. So I'm going to enjoy this journey with you of just hearing stories for the first time of what you observed as a child, but also talking a little bit about like, hey, here's what I've learned and here's why we did things the way we did. Right. And letting you get to be a part of sharing that wisdom with us. Right. Okay, so can you talk more about the Gen 1 worship leader? Who are they? Why are we calling them Gen 1? Like, dive in a little deeper to that so that we can understand it a little better. I'm calling it Gen 1 because I kind of took this from the video game world, right? Okay. Like, so, or the technology world. Console, the very first, video game console is typically referred to as Gen 1, or the very first iPhone is Gen 1, those types of things. So when I think back to the era that I was growing up in, there were really no full-time worship leaders on most church staffs. Yeah. So you're talking mid 80s, I was 8 years old, and most churches were just beginning to think of youth ministers as a full-time staff member. Crazy. So you're seeing kind of the explosion in the initial stages of the megachurch. There were still a lot of like big cathedral style churches, and they would have choir directors, orchestra directors, those type of things. But the regular normal church on the corner had a preacher, a secretary, and maybe a youth minister. Yeah. And so then you kind of in the late 80s, early 90s, you started to see churches kind of buy into this trend that, hey, if we want an exciting church worship experience, we need somebody that can lead songs. Yeah. In fact, they didn't even really call them worship leaders back then. They called them song leaders. Yeah, we were song leaders. And so I remember in the early 90s, after your mom and I got married, we moved to Texas. And there was the church we were at.
was in the Colony, which is this suburb north of Dallas.
It wasn't what it is now.
Yes, no, it was nothing like that. There was nothing out there.
Yeah.
Frisco is this little town and they went even, it was more like a neighborhood by the lake.
Frisco's so bougie now.
It is. It totally is. In fact, it's not even, we're not even going to get into that. Anyway, but we went to a church there, and the senior minister, his name was Monty Tuttle. And I remember, I am 20 years old.
Yeah.
And because your mom and I were high school sweethearts, right? So
Cute.
We got married very young.
Cute.
And moved away to go to Texas to work a job that I had no business working in.
Sure.
But we went to this church, and I remember Monty Tuttle coming to me and saying, hey, would you be our primary song leader? Like, would you lead songs every Sunday for
Primary
us?
song leader.
Now, here's the thing. We were a Church of Christ, so we had no instruments. So everything relied on
vocals.
Vocals. And it was kind of cool because in Churches of Christ, everybody knows how to sing.
Everybody knows how
harmony.
to sing. It's a choir.
So it's like a big choir.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my first experience, and they asked me to do that.
Yeah.
And this was 1995, And I know there were bigger churches that had already hired worship leaders. So that was kind of my first year. So like this year will be my 30th year of leading worship for the church.
That's older than me, just so everyone knows. I am under 30.
I would hope so. The math should work out.
The math is mathing.
So anyway, but in that era, there was really nobody to look up to. There was there were no worship leaders to say, hey, you're retiring, and what do you have to share? How do I build this ministry? How do I get people in my church to sing? How do I teach them what worship is? Yeah. And so I would consider that era the Gen 1
that makes sense.
Worship leader era.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's, probably doctoral level studies out there about, what churches have done, but that's kind of my term that I've given it, the Gen 1 worship
See, he
leader.
knows. You don't have to get in the comments. You don't have to get all up in his comments.
So, and I would say that era lasted from probably the late 80s to the early 2000s. And the reason I would put it in the early 2000s is somewhere in the late 90s, early 2000s, you saw the rise of music like Hillsong.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That was that was kind of the era. Yep. I hate to be this person, but that was really golden era.
It really was. I mean, because
nobody was doing it yet.
It was all new.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of freedom to just kind of create whatever people would sing to.
And Young and Free came out, and everyone was like, what?
That's another podcast.
This can be cool.
So I would consider that kind of the Gen 1 era. And it kind of tracks with like when the Gen X, generation was becoming adults. Yeah. And we kind of were given a church that looked completely different than it does today. Yeah. And so I think this era of worship leader really has no concept of what the church really probably looked like, in that first generation of worship leader. So
I like to think like Gen 1 was the ones who were required to wear a suit and tie at some point in their ministry career. And my generation wears Jordans.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
And denim.
And now I get to wear Jordans, which is pretty awesome because I didn't get to wear them before.
No, you got to be a part of that change.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that was a big part of it, right? Like we saw a church that was a very specific mold. And I think the expectation in that era was that if you wanted to be a part of it, you had to fit the mold. So the idea then was if you wanted to be here, there was a proper way to act, a proper way to dress, a proper way to speak. And I think all of that was very well intentioned.
Sure.
There wasn't I don't think it was intentional of you have to be like us in order to be a part of us.
But it was like, this is holy ground and we're going to treat it.
It was a reverence. It really was. And I think with the baby boomers kind of coming of age, because I'm a child of a baby boomer. So our parents were all in charge, like, hey, why can't we do this different? And then we got to kind of be a part of the leading edge of that. It's like, well, what if worship looked different? What if praying wasn't just everybody bow your heads? What if communion wasn't just passing a tray? What if, we had, we used to do plays in church and things like that. What if we did these things to inspire people to see God differently? Yeah. And so that kind of kicked off this generation.
Yeah. Which is cool too, because you kind of got to see the church go from being just like, we are holy to you can be creative. Yeah. And in comes jobs like mine that couldn't have existed. Yeah. Yeah. Back then.
Yeah. That's true for me too. I never grew up thinking, oh, I want to be the song leader at the church. That wasn't a thing.
That was not your dream.
Nobody thought that. Right. And so
nobody thought he'd be playing guitar either.
Yeah. Church Christ boy here. So
Surprise.
And I think part of the interesting thing about our era is there was a real resistance to change.
Sure.
You had a whole generation that had done church one way for a very, very long time.
And it worked for them.
And it really did.
Yeah.
It really did work for them. And one of the things I like to tell young worship leaders today is like at some point, hymns were modern worship songs. And they just...
We need some other people. Everyone needs to understand that hymns used to be modern worship
Jesus
songs.
did not sing Amazing Grace.
No, he did not.
Right? So at some point that song was written and then the church had to learn it as a new song. And then for whatever reason, we kind of got stuck in this season of we're always going to sing these songs if they were in our hymnals. And we can't add songs to it. We can't take them away from, take any out of it.
That could also be an entire other podcast.
It really can. So we'll leave that right there. But there was this huge resistance to change. And so I think Gen 1 worship leaders were the worship leaders that kind of, in some ways, escorted this change into the church.
Yeah.
Some great ways, some not so great ways. I think we learned a lot of lessons. And again, it was, I think, because there was really nobody who had gone before us. So we were plowing a lot of ground.
Sure.
And we had to learn lessons the hard way sometimes.
Yeah.
But that would be how I would define Gen 1 worship leader.
Okay. I like it.
Yeah.
So like you kind of touched on it, but I want you to kind of talk a lot, like go deeper into it about like the struggle of change in the church and why there was such a struggle to do any kind of change or pass the torch, or why do you think that was so hard for the previous generation?
I think because there was a resistance to change, there was not a willingness to pass on wisdom to the next generation. The people who were leading the church in a lot of ways were trying to establish that this is how it's done.
Yeah.
And so when people like me would come along and say, why can't we do this differently?
Axe.
Yeah, I was like, no, we don't want you a part of this.
Get him out of here.
Yeah. So I think one of the things our generation, the Gen 1 worship leader, missed out on is that mentorship, that discipleship that made it, because there was so much change happening. And I don't know that all of it was great. I don't know that all of it was bad. Like, I think it was just kind of the natural evolution of the growth of the church. But there wasn't that worship leader before me to say, hey, let's do this together. Let me teach you how things work and how they don't work. And I think a lot of us were seeking that. I remember, when I landed in Oklahoma, one of the very first things I tried to do was find somebody that could talk to me about church leadership and worship. And there weren't that many people. And I also think
no one was doing it. So it was hard for someone to like visualize. I'm sure it was hard for people you asked to visualize themselves doing something that nobody had really done or was doing.
And I would say the people that were doing it, there was one of the things I think is great about your generation is there's not a competition between churches like there used to be.
There shouldn't be.
There shouldn't be. But I would say even what does exist is nothing like what it was. And there was a denominational separation.
For sure.
Back in my childhood where denominations really did not work well together. Yeah. And I think it's been kind of cool to watch those walls kind of come down and people work more together. Sure. I think the culture has kind of demanded a little bit of that. So if churches were doing it, and you were part of another denomination, there was no mixing. And so it was really difficult to find people that were willing to say, let me help you. This is kingdom work. Yeah. I just don't think that was the mindset back then. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is, I think, true a lot about my generation. And like, I think the pastors, the lead pastors that like people like me have now are also part of that Gen 1, kind of squad.
We saw it. We saw how hard it was for us.
Who are very much like, hey, like we are one team. You don't have to be at our church. We just want you at a church. Like that is such a common phrasing that I didn't even see when I was a kid. Yeah. That I see a lot now. And it's taught me how to do ministry well. And it's taught me how to be like not as upset if someone leaves our church or like, is like, oh no, they just need to be in community somewhere. Like I'm just happy they're going somewhere. But I didn't see that when I was a kid either. Yeah.
I think part of that was because the church we were a part of, which was a non-denominational Christian church, was part of what's called the Restoration Movement. So a little church history for you. The Restoration Movement was born in the early 1800s. And the idea was of the Restoration Movement that we would be able to worship and congregate together even if we disagreed on some theological things. So that was essentially what it was about. The problem was, as you had 2 or 3 different offshoots of that, that what they did and their method became so important to them that it became doctrinal, and I think this is the thing that I'm trying so hard in this next generation to really talk about is our methods are many, our principles are few. Our methods may change, but our principles never do. And so the idea with that is that things are going to continue to change. They should. The church of 2024 or whenever you're listening to this podcast is not the same church it was in 1984.
No.
And we
or
should.
2014.
And it would be just like if we were going to another country to share the gospel. You would prepare for what that what that country needs to hear based on their culture and what they're surrounded by in order to share the gospel with them. So in 2024, that looks completely different in the West, in the United States, than it did in 1984. And so I think in 2044, it's going to be completely different, and we just have to be ready to deal with that. So the idea would be that, part of the reason you didn't really see that, I think, was just part of kind of the culture that we were building back then, which is like, listen, it doesn't really matter to me when you think salvation happens. What matters to me is that we worship the same Jesus. And doctrinally, you should know that. I don't want to take any doctrinal, but I think there's a difference. How we view the Lord determines our doctrine, right? But for hundreds of years, thousands of years now, there have been way smarter people than me trying to decide some of the most complex things about the Lord, which I don't think we will ever know this side of heaven. So I don't think we need to get caught up in some of these foolish arguments rather than being unified in how we gather together and praise God.
Right. And at the end of the day, like, the church does have one goal. And it's like, let's bring people together to worship God. And let's lead people to Jesus and get people closer to him. Like that is the goal. And so
especially for worship leaders, right? I think if you're, different pastoral positions in the church, different offices, if
have
you will,
different like specific goals.
So if you're a discipleship pastor, which used to not even be a thing, you're probably focused more on how do I, teach people and, about Jesus. But I will say the Great Commission applies to all of us.
It's true.
Or Jesus says, go into all the world, preach the gospel, baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then we kind of stop there. But there's one other statement we forget.
Teach them to observe all I've commanded.
Teach them to obey all I've commanded. And so whether I'm sitting in the seat of worship pastor or senior pastor, or executive pastor, discipleship pastor, whatever that looks like at your church, we still have that obligation to teach people what the Lord has taught us. So and that's really where I want to take this whole podcast is what I've learned in 30 years of leading worship, and how can I share that with the next generation, with people like you who are going to be taking, the reins of the church. We're handing off the car keys in a lot of ways, and we want to make sure that this season is stewarded well by those of us who kind of went before. So
no, that's great. You kind of touched on a couple things, but is there anything specific you would say, like, these are pieces of wisdom that the 26-year-old like me needs to know?
I would say
or like everything, of course, like please go and do better. I would say that to the 18-year-old that wants to be like a worship leader in any kind of ministry. I would say, oh my gosh, be better than me. But like, do you have any specific things that you're like, if you can just leave the room with this?
I think I'll give you three things. Number one, your pursuit of knowing the Lord should be the number one thing in your life, regardless of what you do, regardless of whatever you do. So the older you get, the more you're going to know about the Lord. It is impossible at 25, 26, 27 years old to have a fully formed idea of theology. And theology really is theos and ology. It's the study of how we view God, right? Theos being God and ology being the study of. So how we view God really is our theology. And the more you encounter the Lord, the more you're going to learn about the Lord. The more you read about the Lord, the more you're going to learn about the Lord. And so it's just impossible to know an all-knowing, omnipresent God in just a few years of life. And the truth is we won't fully know him. And Paul says that, like, what we see in part, we will be fully known, And so, like, but never stop pursuing him, because the more you know the Lord, the more you're going to be able to share the Lord. So I think that's number one. Number two, your theology really is important. So as you're seeking the Lord, make sure that you have a biblically based theology. I heard Darlene Check one time as she was talking about handing off Hillsong to Hillsong United, which was like before Young and Free. And so she's talking about Joel Houston and how she's been mentoring him. And I'm at this conference listening. I mean, Joel Houston's on the stage, Darlene Check's on the stage. And she began to make this idea that they just began writing songs, and writing songs were the most important thing to them. They just wanted to write songs for the church to sing. And then she said, and one day we realized we were starting to write songs that weren't even biblical. And she said, and we had to change course. And if you study Darlene Check at all, like that, she loves the Lord and she believes in the Lord. And, so they corrected course because they realized like we have to be biblical in how we view the Lord and the songs we write. And so
not just make something that sounds good, which we could get stuck in as worship leaders.
100%.
Yeah.
So I would say, number one, pursue the Lord. You just have to continue pursuing him. Number two, make sure that your theology is biblical. There's a lot coming at you in your generation I didn't have to deal with. Right.
Say
and
that.
A lot of people who don't even know the Lord who want to tell you who the Lord is. I think that's a big thing. Like that's me,
a quote.
You're probably not going to make me more angry than if you don't actually follow Jesus and you try to tell me who Jesus is. Right. Like, so, but if you don't know the Lord, you don't know the difference between the person who does and the person who doesn't.
Yeah.
And so it's real easy to listen to worldly wisdom. If you go read Romans 1, this is what Romans 1 is all about,
Right.
And what we don't want is to be in a part where Romans 1 was, where it says God turned them over to their own sinful desires. So it's really important to have a biblical theology of the Lord. The reason we have the Bible is so that we can have something consistent and about a God who is consistent.
Yeah.
A God that doesn't change is represented by something that, and this is one of the, I think the fascinating things, that's going to be a whole nother podcast about scripture, is like the more we discover ancient relics and old texts, we see how consistent it's like, it hasn't changed.
Right.
The scriptures we have now really truly are the same scriptures they were reading, when they were being written.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Literally nothing in this world has ever stood the test of time like that.
Yeah. And so I think having a biblical view of that is really important. And then I think the last thing is, if you are a worship leader, and this applies specifically to worship leaders, know what worship is.
Mm-hmm. So talk about that.
Okay.
Talk about what is worship.
And this is why we've called our ministry RomansTwelveOne, because I think you start off in Genesis chapter 22, where the first time you see the word worship ever mentioned in scripture is when Abraham is about to sacrifice
His
Isaac.
son. Wow. Yeah.
And Abraham goes, and here's the deal about that story. God was never going to let Isaac die. The idea is, if you know that story, Abraham had not been able to have a son, and God made him this promise. And so by this point, Isaac is a teenager. Abraham was 100 years old almost before Isaac was born, right? So he finally has the son he's dreamed of literally his whole life. Now he's a teenager, and God says, I want to know if you love me more than you love the blessing that I've given you. So God asks Abraham to give up his son. And so they go to prepare the altar, and they climb up the mountain. And when they get there, they're there with their servants, and Abraham looks at his servants and he says, stay here while the boy and I go to worship. And I think from that point on, the standard of worship is set for the whole entirety of scripture, which is worship is literally a sacrifice for everything we do. And then Paul sums this up in Romans chapter 12, verse 1. He says, therefore I urge you, thank you. This is like, I should know how to say this. Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Or some scripture says this is your true, or some translations will say this is your true and proper worship. So our whole idea of worship is sacrifice, whether it's understanding your role as a pastor is to serve. So you park at the back of the parking lot.
That was another thing about growing up, being Tim Tibble's daughter. He first one at the building, unlocked it on a Sunday. Sun's not up yet. Homie's in the last parking spot he possibly could be in. And I remember being like 15, like, it's hot outside and I am trekking to this car right now. And I was so mad about it. And finally, like one day I asked you and you said, I'm not here to be served. I'm here to serve. And I was so mad. I was like, whatever.
Everything we do is a sacrifice, right? And I think this is the thing people miss about the idea of worship. Everyone worships something. The world is constantly vying and fighting for your attention to worship whatever they want you to.
Right.
You are always being formed to worship. When you walk in the store, what are you doing? You're sacrificing the money you've made to purchase something to make you look like something you want to look like, right?
Yeah.
Or to eat like something you want. And so constantly the world is forming us to worship. And for us as believers, is we realize that we sacrifice ourselves for the benefit of God and his kingdom.
Beautiful.
So that we can worship the Lord.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that going to the store and buying, Jordans is a bad thing, right?
Clearly.
It's where's your priority? Am I willing to sacrifice this thing that God has given me for the benefit of God and his kingdom?
Right.
Do I love the blessing more than I love the Lord who blessed me with it?
Yeah.
And if we are willing to have that as our view of worship, we're willing to have a biblical, theological view of God, and we're willing to pursue God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength for the entirety of our life, I think that's going to be the thing I want the next generation to know.
That's good.
Yeah.
I think we could end there.
We probably could.
I'm like, I could keep going.
No, I think this is really good.
We could do other episodes on all the thoughts that I have right now. So I'm like, I think that's just a solid, cut it there.
Yeah, I think you're right. So in future episodes, what we're going to do is Marty and I are going to have more of these conversations, and but they're going to be involved with other conversations we're going to have with other Gen 1 worship leaders. So I'm constantly pursuing that kind of that first line of worship leader of who was it that was leading worship in the 90s and the 2000s that's now beginning to step off the platform, and how can we share their wisdom with you? So if you're looking for wisdom, if you're a young worship leader, I really hope this works for you, because my goal is to make sure that we are just passing along wisdom, because there's going to be a day we're not going to be here anymore. And what I don't want is for this next generation to say there was nobody there for me.
Yeah. So. Or be scared to take over because they don't have what they need. Yeah.
Exactly. So anyway, thanks for doing this with me. This is going to be fun.
Heck yeah. Be scared, Dad.
I'm
going to put you on the hot seat.
I'm excited.
I'm going to stir the pot.
I'm ready for it. Hey, thanks for joining us today at the RomansTwelveOne podcast. We'll see you next time.